Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. This is Janice Thompson from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining us for our final day, Day 5 of the Tribal Veterans Healing to Wellness Court virtual training. Today's session is Why Have a Veterans Treatment Court? Before we get started, here are a few housekeeping notes for today's session. Your control panel will appear on your user screen. All attendees will be muted during this presentation. Once you call into the meeting call line, enter your PIN. Use the chat box on your right panel to submit questions and responses. To minimize the control panel, use the orange arrow at the top left panel. Following this webinar, please complete the evaluation. A notification email will be sent out containing a recording of this session and any handouts that were referenced. It will also be posted on wellnesscourts.org. I will now turn the time over to our presenter, Mark.
Hi everyone, I'm going to turn on my webcam just for a minute. I can't keep it on real long because it tends to slow down the process. But for at least for the opening part, I wanted to be able to see you guys face to face. I'm really bummed that I couldn't be at the conference in person and that the conference had to go virtual. It's still good. But I think we all have to adapt in these trying times, but I really wish I could have seen you guys in person. But that being said, I think we're going to have a great webinar here, and hopefully you guys will learn a lot. So I just wanted to say hi and let you see me for a minute. And now I'm going to shut off my webcam so we don't slow anything down. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about today is why have a tribal veterans treatment court. So the first thing I wanted to kind of explain to you is who I am and where I'm working from and what company I work with. So I'm going to start with the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. That is the company that I'm a project director with. We're a premier training, membership, and advocacy organization, and we help train for the treatment court model, which we've done with over 4,000 programs found in every state, 4 territories, and over 20 countries. We partner often with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute to work especially in Indian country, and it's my pleasure to be able to do that. My name is Mark Panasiewicz. I'm a project director with Justice for Vets, which is a division of NADCP, but I'm also the project director for the Tribal Healing and Wellness Court Planning Initiative. I'm a veteran of the United States Air Force. I'm a clinical therapist. I was a prison guard at one time, and I've even been a magician. So I'm a little bit of everything and all over the place. So it's my pleasure today to be able to reach out to you guys and talk to you about why having a tribal veterans treatment court is so important. Now, Janice is remotely controlling my slides, so a lot of times I'm going to say next. And then there's going to be a slight delay because there's a little bit of delay with the web. But then the next slide should pop up. I think we figured there's between a 5 and 10 second delay with that. So you can go ahead and do next on that one, Janet, if you haven't already. There we go. Whoop, there we go. So one of the big things that we want to talk about when we talk about why having a tribal veterans treatment court is so important is, number one, so many Native Americans have served in the military. If we look at the overall percentage per capita, Native Americans have served in the military more than any other minority branch. And that's what these statistics here are trying to show. It shows how many served pre-9/11, and then also it shows veterans in general, and including female veterans. The other thing that we have to realize too when we talk about this is that Native American veterans are actually more likely to be service connected with disability than any others. So there is a long warrior tradition in Indian country for serving in the military. Go ahead next. The reason why this is so important when we talk about that is because of this next slide right here, which is the veterans in prison. So when we start looking at how many veterans are ending up in prison and jail in 2011 and 2012, we can see that there's a high number of people who have served in the military, came out, had difficulties, and then ended up in our prisons and jails. And so when we talk about why we need to have a veterans treatment court, this is one of the reasons why. Now, oftentimes, what people think is that we should have a veterans treatment court to to honor the veterans, and that's not necessarily true. When we talk about having a veterans treatment court, We're not saying we're doing this because we want to honor them, which we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't honor veterans. We absolutely should honor veterans. But that's not the primary reason why we can do that, because we could honor veterans with other programs like diversion programs and such like that. The reason why we want to do this is because of a gentleman named Robert Russell, and he was a judge in Buffalo, New York. What Judge Russell realized, because he was doing a mental health treatment court, is he had a veteran that was in his mental health treatment court, and when the veteran would come up, he was the body language was broken, and he wasn't engaging in treatment, and he wasn't engaging in services, and he could see that there was something just not connecting. So what Judge Russell did is he had a couple of veterans that worked in his treatment court. One was a coordinator, and I believe the other one was with the VA. And he asked them to talk with this veteran and to see if there was some kind of services or something they could do. Well, right around a week later, or a couple weeks later, that veteran came back into court and he was fully engaged. He was standing up, he made eye contact, he had connection. And that's when Judge Russell realized that there was something there, about having veterans working with veterans. And so that's what started the whole process of having a veterans treatment court. And so when we go back to and look at the Native Americans who are in jail and prison and who are veterans, that's what we're kind of trying to target in on. We're trying to target in on not so much the honoring the veteran part, but the connection of what makes a veteran connected with other veterans. Next, please. Okay, so when we go back again to these statistics, again, we can see that 25% of veterans in prison and 31% in jail reported they'd been in combat in the military. The other thing we noticed is when we talk about this, is that we see that they also have mental health professions and they have had some type of mental health disorder. This is important because we have to realize that we need to start treating people instead of just putting them in jail. And that's, again, when we're talking about that veteran connection, that's what we're looking at. All right, you'll also notice that 64% of veterans versus 48% of non-veterans were sentenced for violence offenses. This is important to me because I don't think that people realize that when we get put in the military, we're taught how to deal with certain situations, but we're not necessarily taught how to change that belief system. And I think that's why a lot of our veterans end up in the criminal justice system that they do. So we're going to go back and go ahead and hit next, please. So when we talk about that connection and that culture, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that veterans have a unique culture that is just with veterans. All right. And so we realize that we have to look at how they're each different and how they're each connected. All right. Because military culture is unique and different than other cultures, that warrior culture. All right. Next, please. One of the things we talk about when we talk about that culture is the warrior ethos, okay? And what that means is that when we're in the military, we have a sense of purpose, we have a code of conduct, we have a common purpose, we have identity, we have morality, selflessness, sacrifice, loyalty, and honor. These are all things that are taught to us. When I was in the Air Force, one of the biggest things that they stressed over and over and over again was the integrity, that you had to have integrity no matter what. And for some people, they don't understand that. When I went in the military, there was a big push for if you were caught doing things criminally, a lot of times they would actually require you to go into the military or you would go to jail. And so it was interesting to see people coming into the military who were getting taught some values that maybe they hadn't learned when they were out in the world before that, through whatever social values or whatever there was. But once they got in the military, there was a unifying purpose of everything. We always had a sense of purpose. Even in boot camp or anything like that, we always had this sense of purpose, and we also had a code of conduct. And part of it is that you were held accountable by each other. So a good example is in boot camp. If you do something wrong, it's not just you that gets to made to do push-ups. Oftentimes, it's your whole flight or platoon or squad. And so what ends up happening is because of this common purpose and this code of conduct, you start holding each other accountable and in line with each other to get what you need. Go ahead and hit next. So when we look at this, we look at the impact of transition, okay? And a lot of people don't understand this. So a lot of times when we're in the military, we have what's called discharge and out processing, okay? And what that means is when you're in the military and you're getting out, they discharge you and they out process you. Now, when I was in, that out processing was really quick. So most of my term in the Air Force, I did in Okinawa, Japan. When I discharged, they flew me back to the States, and within 5 days, I was a civilian. It was very, very fast. Now, I know that they're doing a slightly better job of that and putting a little bit more time, but oftentimes people that are coming out through combat and stuff like that are out processing very quick. So you can go from being in the military to out of the military without a real big transition point. And the problem with that is that what the point on number 2 on the slide says is that disconnected from civilian society, when you out process, you are still feeling like you're part of the military, even though you're now part of the civilian society. And so there's a huge disconnect about that. And when that happens, you have a loss of support, a loss of identity, and a loss of purpose. And the other thing is it's hard to figure out where to go. One of my work partners, David Peltier, talks about when he got done being a Marine. So when David went into the Marines and he went to boot camp, the first thing they told him was that at least he wasn't a dirty civilian anymore, that he was now a Marine. And so when David out processed, he got really lucky. He out processed in the same state and community as his base. So he got to literally just leave base and out process. Well, the problem was when he out processed, he suddenly wasn't a Marine anymore. He was a dirty civilian again. And so even if he wanted help, even if he wanted to look for support from his friends, he couldn't just go back on base. And he also lost an identity and he lost a purpose. When I out processed from the Air Force, I went from working on multi-million-dollar jets, F-15s as a crew chief, to nothing, just being Mark again. And that was really hard because a lot of times, particularly with males, sometimes we associate our job with part of our identity. And when we lose that, we can lose that sense of purpose and lose that ability to figure it out. Next, the other part of that when we talk about that is where to go for assistance. When we start looking at that, where to go from assistance, that's going to become a big play in the slides to come. But one of the things that happens is we don't exactly know where to turn. And being in the military, we're not often good at asking for help anyways, because we've been taught we kind of have to survive on ourselves, you know? And so one of the things when we talk about that having to survive by ourselves, one of the things we look at is this thing called embracing the suck. Embracing the suck is the belief that no matter how bad it gets, we still have to complete the mission. You know, so when you're in the military, it doesn't really matter if you're not feeling well or if your legs hurt or anything like that, because the mission has to be completed either way. And so what ends up happening is this thing we call embracing the suck. And the reason why I bring this up is because it also plays into a lot of these things that we're looking here on the slide. So I want to go back to the embrace the suck just a little bit more before we move on. When I say that, there's many different factors that play into that embracing the suck. You know, when we look at seeking out services, seeking out mental health help, we don't get that because we're so used to being in the military that you just suck it up and deal with it, that we tend to be very reserved on seeking help because somehow or another we think that seeking help is going to make us weak. And we don't want to appear weak, so we try to just embrace the suck and do everything on our own. You know, part of this, when we talk about that, we talk about feeling that their military skills and experience are often dismissed. So when we look at that, we look at, I'll use my example. When I left the military, I was a crew chief on F-15. I worked on a multi-million-dollar jet, and all of a sudden, I went from that to having to bag groceries because that was the only job that I could find was bagging groceries. And when that occurred, I felt like my experiences were dismissed. I didn't feel important. A lot of my stuff didn't carry over. working on jets didn't carry over to bagging groceries. And so I didn't feel like even the stuff I could talk about was important. I didn't think that civilians could understand the problems faced by me. Again, that embrace the suck. I didn't feel like I could relate to them because they didn't have any idea of what I was going through. The other part of this too is I felt really distant from people because I had a military brotherhood that I didn't have when I got out of the military. So one of the things that I was drawn to was law enforcement. And so I ended up becoming a corrections officer because I wanted that military feeling again. Even the people around me that I knew, I didn't feel like I belonged to them. That's again why I was drawn to that corrections officer point of being there. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is just the term veteran. A lot of times when we look at that term veteran, there's a real unique definition of what that can mean. So I'll go back to my military service because I think this is important. When I was in the military, President Clinton took over and he was doing this thing called reduction of forces. And what that meant is that if you qualified, they would pay you money to get out of the military early. And so I took that early out option and took a paycheck to get out early. So I didn't do my full 4-year enlistment. I did it non-active duty because you still had to do that. So I ended up doing right around 3 years of active duty and then right around 5 years of inactive duty. And I got a paycheck. The thing is when I took that paycheck and I got out of the military, I didn't really feel like I had the right to call myself a veteran. I did serve during Desert Storm, but I didn't see any active combat. And so again, for many years, if somebody would ask me, about that, when I talked to people, I didn't make it known that I was a veteran. I would say I was in the Air Force if it came up, but I never identified and qualified myself as a veteran because I didn't think that I had that right. I'll be honest, until I started working for NADCP, when I would introduce myself, I would introduce myself as a clinical therapist. I would introduce myself as a former prison guard, even the magician part. But oftentimes I would leave out that I was a veteran of the United States Air Force until my boss would speak up right in the middle of my presentations and say, and he was a member of the United States Air Force and is a veteran. And it's because I had a real hard time identifying with that. And so that's one of the things you need to look at when we're talking about having a veterans treatment program is making sure that you're getting the people that are going to identify as veterans and making sure you ask them if they've ever served in the United States military. Another one that gets brought up oftentimes when we talk about veteran status is individuals in the National Guard. Many times individuals in the National Guard are not considered veterans unless they've served a certain amount of time in combat or on deployment, but they still seen trauma and all that type of things. And so you have to ask yourself when you're creating this program and when you're looking at your veterans, are you counting National Guard and reserves as people who are veterans? And that's part of the things that civilians don't understand about the problems faced by veterans. And I'm not even talking about active duty veterans. I'm talking about National Guard veterans. When we look at them, imagine what it must be like to go in on for your weekend for your service and be flying a drone that's launching attacks at people and your people are dying. And then when you're done with your weekend, you just go back to your normal family. People don't realize what kind of situations that can create. And that's when we talk about that civilians don't understand the problems faced by veterans. That's some of the things we're talking about. And again, that feeling distant from people because they don't understand what you're living and what you've been through. When we talk about even being around people that you don't really feel like you belong. That happens often in military and in law enforcement. And so that's one of those things we have to understand is that there's going to be a large percentage of veterans who don't feel comfortable just in everyday situations. And that sense of sisterhood and brotherhood. Unless you've been there, it's really hard to explain that. But when you go through basic training and when you go through similar experiences, they're all there and connected. One of the things, when I have a live audience I can interact with more, one of the things I ask is, what's your favorite MRE? You know, what's the one that you like to eat? And I ask all the veterans in the room. Most of the time they'll come up with the ones they liked, or some of them will come up with the ones they hate. And what I usually say to them is, I was in the Air Force, I didn't have to eat MREs. And that's part of that. Even that part of that culture is teasing each other. You know, military brothers tease each other constantly. The Marines will tease the Navy as they're just their taxis. And so you see a lot of that kind of interaction and that brotherhood and that connection. I used to tease people that were in the Coast Guard all the time, but I can't do that now because of that submarine video of the Coast Guard jumping on top of the drug runner submarine and banging on the hood. But those are those things that we're talking about, is that there's a connection through military. And when you have that military culture and that connection, that's what we're looking for. We're not having a veterans treatment court just to honor a veteran. We're doing it because there's a certain connection and a certain degree of accountability that happens when you interact with other veterans. Okay, next slide, please. So part of this, when we talk about this, I wanted to go through and define the 10 key components, because I believe they're so incredibly important that we make sure we discuss these. And so I want to go through them real quick and explain why they connect with a veterans treatment court and why they're so important. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about, go ahead and you can hit next, please. The first one we're going to talk about is justice and treatment integration. Okay, so the thing here is this. For a while there, probation felt like they were the answer to everything, and that with that probation system that they were going to be able to solve some of the problems and with our criminal justice, and it just didn't seem to work out that well. And then on the same side, you had people screaming that treatment and mental health was the way to go. And so you had treatment providers that were also trying to figure a way to help people and get them out of the criminal justice system. And what they kind of found out is that both sides were getting played by the other. And what I mean by that is you would have really highly manipulative individuals, and not because they necessarily chose to be manipulative, but because that became a survival mechanism. You know, and that's one of the things I always stress when I talk about these 10 key components and about that, is that oftentimes the individuals we're dealing with are coming from trauma backgrounds and from things that we don't understand, and they've developed very unhealthy ways to survive. But that's what they are, as survival mechanisms. And trying to get them to change those is difficult because they've worked, because they're still alive and they're still functioning. And so when I talk about this, what I mean by justice and treatment integration, what I mean by that is that I go to my treatment provider, I'm charming, I tell them everything they want to hear, I tell them how great they are, and I interact with them completely, or it seems to appear. And then I get to a point where I can start saying to my treatment provider, oh, I can't really make it next week because, you know, my Aunt Kathy died, or my kids got a project. And what ends up happening is, not all the time, but often, the treatment provider can be manipulated with that. And so he starts letting the client maybe miss appointments, or maybe not holding them accountable when they're not doing their homework, and that type of thing. And then that same individual goes to the probation officer and gives a completely different story. It says everything's great and there's no problems. And so what you end up having is two entities that aren't communicating anymore. And so that kind of became the point of all this, is that we need to integrate the two into one. And the way we did that is by having these 10 key components. One of them is, you know, when we talk about an integration of justice and treatment, you know, these systems weren't interwoven together. And so what we're trying to do now is trying to bring a team together so that we can interweave as much of this as possible so that we can not be separate anymore, you know. And the way we do that is by having the things listed here: equity, inclusion, making sure that we're allowing everybody in the program. We have a judge that has roles and responsibilities. We use sanctions, incentives, and therapeutic adjustments to change behaviors. along with substance use disorder treatment. And then we have that multidisciplinary team so that there's no holes, that we can kind of promote recovery through a coordinated response. And we can also do this by planning and documentation. And it allows us to see those gaps that we're maybe missing or not seeing. Next, please. Okay, non-adversarial approach. The reason why this is important is the same thing as when we talk about this, is we want to facilitate an individual's progress in treatment, and we need the prosecutor and the defense to have a non-adversarial approach so that we can promote public safety. Now, here's the big key. The big thing to remember here is both of those sides, the prosecution and the defense attorney, even if they're on a treatment court team, still have a responsibility to provide public safety. The key difference here is before, the ways that they were providing public safety was by mostly just putting them in jail. And what they found was that wasn't working, that the adversarial approach wasn't working, and it was also sucking up resources like crazy. So what we tried to do here is when we're talking about this non-adversarial approach is we're trying to make sure we include both the prosecution and defense and let them do their jobs, but also do it in a way that we can include treatment and we can change the way we're doing the stuff. So it's keeping the whole system together, but also doing it in a better way to protect public safety. So before, when we would just throw people in jail, it was short-term protection of public safety, but not long-term. Because oftentimes those individuals would get out of jail because we can't keep them there forever, and then they would reoffend. And so that wasn't really protecting public safety. Whereas with a highly structured program where we can change behavior and monitor somebody, we have a much better chance of doing public safety and protecting the rights of the individual at the same time. Next, please. Okay, key component 3, early identification. So this is a huge part of this, is that we have to identify them quickly and we have to get them into services as fast as possible. And when we're doing that, when we're looking at identifying them quickly, we're looking for target populations, which are usually high risk and high need, meaning a high risk for reoffending and a high need for substance abuse treatment or mental health treatment. It's really important that when we're doing this, that we're making sure that we're using equity and inclusion, and we're not, the best way to put it is we're not skipping over the hard cases. A lot of times, sometimes treatment courts get wrapped up in low-hanging fruit that's easy to work with. And what I mean by that is somebody that has a first-time offense or hasn't been on probation in the past. Picking them up seems like it would be doing better, but it's really not. And that's why it's so important to have an accurate risk need assessment so we can make sure that we're identifying them early and picking them up quickly. Next, please. Okay, key component 4. Okay, this is huge. One of the things that we need to realize when we're working with the population we are, which should be high risk, high need, is that oftentimes they don't need rehabilitation, they need habituation, meaning that they haven't had rehabilitation yet because they don't know the stuff. We have to teach them. And what I mean by that is the example I've used in the past is I had a client that from a very young age, her mother and father made it a game to go into Walmart and steal and say, and whoever could steal the most valuable item would win the game. And so she grew up in an environment where it was okay to steal, but it wasn't okay to get caught. Now, to take her and say it's not okay to steal, she's not going to grasp that because she's been taught that this is the way it is. So we have to reteach. A lot of times they don't have the basic things that they need to learn. And so that's when we talk about continuum of services. And this is where we also talk about that just the treatment court team isn't going to be able to just fix them. You need a whole plethora of partners to help you with this, you know. And what we're talking about is targeted case management when we're looking at that. You know, we have to make sure that we treat the entire individual. And this is one of the things that tribal healing and wellness courts have been doing ahead of the game, is they also recognize that we have to treat the entire family. Because, as you know, in Native American communities, family is so important that if you don't target that whole family and do entire case management, then oftentimes you're setting people up for failure. So when we look at this, we look at all the things that we need to do. We need to look at trauma. Trauma. We need to have trauma-informed care when we do this. Because if we don't look at that entire picture, then we miss that mental health picture also. And I haven't met anybody yet that has a substance use disorder that doesn't have some type of mental health need to go along with that with a co-occurring disorder. And when we look at the military, we might not have, when we look at veterans, we might not have substance use disorder, but we might have some very, very big mental health issues, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury or military sexual trauma. Those are all things that might come up where if we don't treat those, then we're not treating the problem, we're only treating some of the symptoms. You know, getting somebody to stop using substances often is just treating a symptom. You need to get to the core of the problem so that you can start working on that. And the other part of this is when we look at this, when we talk about this continuum of services, one of the things that we look at is you're taking away a major coping mechanism. So for example, we'll use substance use disorder and we'll use a veteran. And let's say that I had a military sexual trauma. And what do I mean by military sexual trauma? It means that somewhere in my military career, somebody violated me either through threats of sexual harassment or through actual physical sexual contact. And it's done a number on me. So let's say that while I was going through basic training, my drill instructor pulled me into an office and told me that I had to give him oral sex. And I'm not trying to offend anybody, but let's say that happened. Well, number one, embrace the suck, right? Who do I tell? I'm in basic training. It's my drill instructor. I really don't have an avenue to tell anybody. Am I going to tell my military brothers and maybe have them look at me funny? Probably not. And so I try to compartmentalize it. So I make it through basic training, and to deal with my issues, I start drinking. Well, now if I go and get treatment for substance use disorder, but we never tackle that military sexual trauma, all you're really doing to me now is trying to take away my coping skill. You're trying to take away the thing that I found that'll take away that pain. That doesn't generally work, because the only thing that's really going to happen is I'm probably going to look for another unhealthy coping skill because I'm not dealing with that trauma in the first place. The only thing I'm dealing with is the symptom. And so oftentimes when we look at this, we have to realize that we have to look for the cause and start rooting that out. And the way we do that is by giving them different skills and different ways to cope through effective substance use disorder treatment and effective mental health disorder treatment. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be substance use. It could be that I have PTSD or I have a traumatic brain injury and I don't want to leave my house, you know? And so when I do leave my house, I get violent, you know, or I'm hypersensitive. And so I have an anger issue problem and I start getting in fights and I'm getting arrested. That's another way that a veteran could become justice involved without having it be substance use. And so we need to remember that when we look at veterans treatment courts, we're not just looking at substance use disorder, we're looking at also mental health issues that could be coming up and preventing them from functioning. So when we go back to that continuum of services, that's the things that we need to look at when we're talking about continuing to help them. Housing. You can't ask me to start working on myself if I'm worried every night where I'm sleeping. If I'm worried I'm going to get jumped in my cardboard box underneath the bridge. Transportation. I know that, and especially in Native American communities, especially the rural ones, that sometimes transportation is a huge issue. And you can't ask me to go to my substance use therapy if it's 40 miles away and I have one car that's being shared between 3 families, which I've seen that often on reservations, where one car is shared by 3 different families on a block. So those are things when we're talking about this, when you're looking at what your program is going to complete, you need to realize that there has to be this continuum of services, because if there isn't, then what you're doing is you're setting people up for failure. You're telling them, we want you to go to see substance use help, but we're not going to help you figure out the solution to get you there. And again, asking them to figure out these solutions isn't necessarily fair, because they haven't been trained how to figure out some of these solutions. They haven't been in an environment where this was taught, and so to suddenly ask them just to have a solution, that's setting them up for failure, and it's not fair. And that's where that case management and when we start looking at this continuum of services, it falls into. So we have to make sure that if we're doing these components, that we're doing all of them, not just some of them. And I've often seen key component 4 get thrown off to the side, or the responsibility be put solely on the participant, which again is not fair because they don't have that ability yet. Next, please. Okay, drug testing. This is huge. And the reason why it's huge is because it's what's going to give credibility to your program. Okay, now, we just talked about veterans who don't necessarily have an active substance use disorder. Should we still be drug testing them? They've never had an issue with substance abuse. They've never had an issue with alcohol. They have some mental health issues. They have some PTSD or military sexual trauma. They're starting to engage with therapy. Should they still be drug tested? Oftentimes, people will say, no, they don't have a drug problem. We shouldn't drug test them. Well, again, let's go back to that coping, okay? Because when we look at coping skills that people have, oftentimes they're lacking. And when they start engaging in substance use disorder treatment or mental health treatment, what ends up happening is that embracing the suck comes up, and they're dealing with stuff that they've never dealt with before and that they've bottled away for a long period of time. And when that happens, it becomes very easy that instead of feeling stuff, they'll turn to unhealthy coping styles. And so, not all the time, but often, people that didn't have a substance use disorder could develop one while they're trying to deal with their mental health issues, because this is an easy way to treat things. And the other thing is that people don't realize this all the time, but the military has a huge alcohol acceptance. It's part of the culture. Alcohol use is part of the culture. Almost every time you gain in rank, there's some type of alcohol party. Any kind of big milestone in the military is almost always followed by some type of alcohol. In some branches of the service, when you go up in rank, you go to the bar and you open up a tab for the increase that you're going to have on your paycheck, and everybody drinks on you until that quota is met. When you deploy to new places, there's a drinking tradition. In Okinawa, the tradition when new people came to the base was they would be taken out and they'd be taken to all these little bars, and they'd have one drink at each bar. And then the last bar, they would get ordered a bottle of soju, which is a giant bottle of alcohol with a snake in the bottom. And one of the unique things about soju is when you drink it, it doesn't really hit you until you stand up. And so what would happen is you would take the newbie and buy them a whole bunch of drinks of soju, and then they would stand up. And a lot of times they would pass out right when they stood up, and then you would strip them down in their boxers and put them on their doorstep as a military prank. But it's just another example of how acceptable alcohol is. And it's also used as a coping skill often. And so the reason why we're going to still drug test people in a veterans treatment court, regardless if they have a mental health problem or a substance use disorder, is because of that reason, is because it's very likely that they could turn to alcohol or drugs to cope with the issue. So we want to make sure that we do that. Now, the next part is random, okay? And that means that it occurs randomly at least 2 times a week, and the participants don't know. I was doing a training at a treatment court, and when we asked them about their success rate, they told us it was 100%. that they had 100% success rate and nobody was caught using drugs or alcohol in their program ever. And I was amazed. I said, oh my God, that's incredible. I mean, how were you able to do that? And they said they didn't know. And I said, well, when do you drug test them? And they said, we drug test them every Wednesday. They all come in. And everybody knew they were drug tested every Wednesday. So I suggested that maybe they do a drug test today on Thursday, just before court, just to see what happens. Well, every one of them tested positive. So because they didn't think they were going to get in trouble. So they have to be random. And the other part is observed. And I know that sometimes this makes people feel uncomfortable, but it's one of the things that you learn in law enforcement and as a prison guard for me, is that you have to see the package leave the factory. And that means you have to observe them, the urine physically leaving the body. And I know that for some people that's uncomfortable, and a lot of times veterans will throw a fit saying, you know, this is ridiculous, I shouldn't have to do this. In the military, the same thing happens. If you get drug tested in the military, there's somebody that goes in a room with you and they watch the package leave the body, you know, and the reason why that's so important is because otherwise it's very easy to tamper with them, and it's very easy to substitute samples and those types of things. So we really want to make sure that even though it's uncomfortable and even though people may not like it, that we make sure we see that. Now, oftentimes I've seen these things called hats used, where they're put right on a toilet and everybody just has to sit right on the toilet and use the hat, you know, without any pants on. So, but that's one of those reasons why this is so important. Next, please. Now, the reason why I said about the observed is this right here. And this is a pretty good example of why. You'll look at the caption, need male who can pass a urinalysis at TASC, must be able to use my ID, text with a picture, I'll pay you $20. So this guy went online and was asking somebody that looked like him to go in and take his drug test so that he could pass it. This is only one of many. And I will tell you right now, there are tons of ways to trick and cheat drug tests. I have said that, because I am a sailor, I like to sail, and I've said that if I ever was stuck on a deserted island after my sailboat sank, I would hope it would be with somebody that had substance use disorder, because I know that within a week we'd find a way off that island, because they would be determined. I have seen Wizinators, which are artificial members that you can use to use pee. I have seen them use prenatal vitamins to try to get the creatine up so that they can flush without having it come up. They will find a way to try to trick a drug test. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to make sure we observe. I had a client that she got caught finally, but she was testing clean, and we could tell that she was not clean. And so we finally got her on a random test and it came back positive. And when we asked her about the way that she was having a clean drug test, she told us that she would run around behind her dog with a diaper and catch the dog's urine and then squeeze it out into a receptacle that she could keep close to her so it'd be warm. And she was using that urine when she would come in and do the drug test. So that's, again, the level of devotion that they can have. And that's also that brain disease that happens, you know? So next slide, please. Okay, a coordinated strategy. Okay, and what this means is that when we talk about a coordinated strategy, we're talking about all team members participate. Okay, so what we mean by that is that oftentimes we're not all going to agree, and that's okay, because that's the way this is designed to happen. Okay, we're not always supposed to agree, but one of the things we can't do is we can't let our egos get in the way of this. And I'm going to talk from a treatment perspective, and I'm not trying to pick on treatment providers, but sometimes treatment providers get really upset when they suggest a sanction or it doesn't work or their suggestions aren't heard. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't listen to our treatment providers? No, you should, and you should definitely take their opinion into it. And you should also look at the therapeutic treatment that should be going on. But it also doesn't mean that we get to take our ball and go home if we think something is not going our way. And that's one of the things that we look at. The only person that ultimately gets to make the decision here is going to be the judge. And the judge is going to take the opinions and recommendations of all the treatment team and then make his decision. It's not always going to go the way we want, and it shouldn't always go the way we want. Part of what I try to teach people is oftentimes we're working with individuals that have antisocial personality disorder. And people with antisocial personality disorder are very, very good at manipulating systems. They learn how to game a system. And that's one of the reasons why treatment courts can be so successful with them, is because it's hard to game the system because there's so many different teams and so many disciplines working together in a coordinated strategy that it's hard to manipulate. You would if you were just dealing with a therapeutic provider or just dealing with a probation officer or just dealing with a law enforcement officer. You're taking them all together and you're trying to make sure that you're doing a coordinated strategy, you know? And this is going to show up when you see how much they comply with the treatment regime. You know, the ultimate goal here is to get them to stop using substances or to deal with their mental health issues. But we need to remember it's a progressive goal and that it's going to take some time to get there, and it's going to take some time for us to work through this. You know, you have to reward cooperation as well as respond to noncompliance. And that's another thing that I think that we forget often, is that we forget that we're very big on sanctioning, but we're not so big on rewarding. And we really need to make sure that when we do this, that we center on that reward center and we center on that ability to push that through, you know? The other thing to recognize is that individuals in this program, no matter how great your program is, they're still going to have a tendency to relapse. And it's not condoned. We're not condoning relapse, but we also have to have an appropriate response, okay? And we have to make sure that when we're doing that response, we're centering on proximal and distal goals, and we're centering on the progress that the participant is making. Next. Okay, judicial supervision. This is huge. The judge ends up becoming a commanding officer in this court, okay? And for those who haven't been in the military, praise from your commanding officer can be ginormous. It shows that you're doing your job right. It shows that you're following those military culture and that nuance. So having that connection is just huge for everything. So the other thing that when we look at, when we talk about judicial supervision, we're also talking about an authority figure similar to a parent. So oftentimes, when we look at the participants that are going through, because we're looking at high risk, high need, and by high risk, we mean not risk to public safety or anything like that, but we're looking at high risk for reoffending, for offenses. The family system that they came from can be broken. And so they may have never had praise in a positive way from an authority figure. Most of the time when we talk about team roles that are a big deal, we talk about law enforcement, probation, and judicial. And the reason why those are big is because they all represent an authority figure, with the judicial supervision or the judge being the top of that pile. And so anytime that we can see that with a judge where he is engaging with a participant and genuinely caring, and I think that's an important part of this, is that you have to genuinely care. And every judge I've worked with, I see that caring. And the ones that are successful are ones that are firm, fair, and consistent, but they genuinely care about a person. Again, when we talk about antisocial personality, they have a unique ability of also being able to tell when somebody is not being genuine. And so if you give praise to somebody with that mental health issue, for example, if I had antisocial personality disorder and I walked in a room and you didn't know me and you said, "Oh, Mark, you're so smart, you're so great, you know, you're amazing," I would be able to tell almost immediately that the praise you're giving me isn't real because you don't know me. And that actually would do more damage to me than genuine praise. And so when we talk about judicial supervision and praise, and this is why this system and why the treatment court and the veteran treatment court work so successfully, is because we give praise for legitimate accomplishments. So we don't just say, oh, you're a great person and you're awesome. We say, I'm very proud of you for showing up for court today. I know that's been hard for you in the past. I see that you went a week clean. That's amazing, and we're going to give you a reward for doing that. Or you followed curfew all this week. So we're looking at accomplishable small goals that they can do, that they can get genuine praise for. This is the way we start changing behavior. Too often, people think that it's the sanctions that are going to change the behavior. And every behavior modification study out there, they show that yes, punishment does have some effect for changing behaviors, but it's not long lasting. What's long lasting is praise. And that's why this is so incredibly important for the judge to recognize that he is that person. He's going to be the one that makes the decision, ultimately based on his team's recommendations, that he has, that role and responsibility of doing that. And he's going to be the one handing out the sanctions and incentives. And it's his authority of caring that's going to make that difference when we talk about change. Next, please. Okay, monitoring and evaluation. Okay, this is another one that often gets neglected that I think it's really, really incredibly important to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to start on the evaluation section first. Okay, we need to have evaluators in our drug court programs. I've worked with a lot of different treatment courts that feel like their system is working the best. They feel like it works best. And examples of that are sending people to jail for longer than they need and all these types of behavior. And here's the problem with that, is that just because I am on a treatment court team and I put somebody in jail for 25 days and they suddenly get recovery and sobriety and they start doing well, that doesn't mean that I'm doing the best thing for my program. I may feel like it is, but the problem is I don't see the other 8 people I did that to that failed out completely. And so what I start basing things on is statistics based on feelings, not on facts. And when we do that, we can't tell if a program is truly successful. We can't tell what's working. We can't tell what's not working because we're basing things strictly on a feeling. A good example of that is the treatment court I talked about before, that they felt like everybody was doing great. They had no positive tests, but their feeling, which was what it was a feeling, and it wasn't based on facts because they weren't following the best practice. Now, the minute they started following best practice, those facts suddenly became very real, and they seen that their program wasn't as successful. Evaluation of what's working is amazingly good for your program because then you can tell other programs what's working. On the same note, evaluation for things that aren't working allows you to change and make adjustments. I mentioned I'm a sailor. I always equate this to adjusting your sails. That when you put your sails up, you don't just leave them up. You always are constantly trimming them and adjusting them to try to get the best possible catch of the wind that you can get. And so without evaluation, you can't trim the sails of your program. You can't look at that. And that's incredibly important to do. The other thing is, and I don't want to make it about money, but data equals dollars. If you can start showing changes in recidivism, if you can start showing now the things that your program is doing right, how you're correcting the things you're doing wrong, that's what makes you a sustainable institution instead of experimentation. If you don't have evaluation to back up data and show what you're doing, then a lot of times you're going to end up a 2-year experiment that goes away. Whereas if you do evaluation, you can get cost savings and you can see what's working with your program and what's not. And again, if you look at the slide, you can see that there's 131 greater cost saving by programs that review data and statistics to modify their internal program. So that's a fact. That's not an opinion. When you don't use an electronic database, you get 65% less savings. So this is the kind of thing when we talk about evaluation, having a program evaluator who can look at your program and compare your numbers and look at your recidivism and those things, it's really essential to have those things. The other thing when we talk about is monitoring. again, we want to monitor and see how we're doing. We want to monitor how our clients are doing, or our participants. And so this is the way we do that. And the other thing too is when you have evaluation and monitoring, you have a much better chance for equity and inclusion, meaning that we're not going to leave certain populations out. And we're not going to show special treatment to certain populations in the community. So next, please. Okay, here's a big one. And since you're all here on this webinar, you already got this. You already got part of this. Continuing education, okay? Interdisciplinary education. What that means is this. Too often, I see treatment court teams, healing to wellness court teams, they go for one training, they start their court, and then they don't get any more training or very limited training. Or one person starts to go to all the trainings and nobody else does, and then slowly positions on the team are changed because people leave, people change jobs, and the next thing you know, you've got one person that's been to training and 4 other people that haven't. You have got to have ongoing training like this. And I would like to add too that the NADCP conference, the RISE virtual, will be occurring next week, and hopefully you guys will attend that also and get some additional training. But the point is that you have to have ongoing training. It has to be ongoing. And the other thing I've noticed from conferences is that all the treatment providers go to the treatment provider plenaries or sessions, and all the lawyers go to all the legal sessions, and all the judges go to the judges sessions, and that's great. But there also has to come a point where you do a little cross training, not because you're going to become a therapist or a lawyer, but it's kind of that whole thing of walking in somebody else's shoes to get a feel for things and get an understanding of why they're doing what they're doing and why their confidentiality might be different than a lawyer's confidentiality, and how those roles and responsibilities kind of connect. I think it's incredibly important. If you don't have an understanding of why addiction is a disease, except for somebody's told you, yeah, you going to a training where somebody can explain the science and the neural pathways and why things are they are and why it's not a choice, that's huge, because that'll give you a whole understanding of the participants. If you have no experience with mental health disorders and you're working with people that have mental health disorders, I don't want you to become a therapist, but you should have a basic of understanding of what they're happening and what's going on. Same thing with looking at the lawyer side of this. If you have no idea what it's like to be a district attorney in charge of public safety, you going to some of those ethics trainings that they have to go through might be eye-opening. It might give you a whole different perspective. Too often I've seen teams where the treatment providers are angry at the defense, or not the defense, but the prosecuting attorneys, the DAs, because they won't let people in the program. Well, they don't realize that if something goes wrong, it's that DA that's going to have to answer for it, and often those are elected officials. And so they have to make sure they have an eye on public safety and public opinion. And if you don't get that cross training, you'll never understand what that's like. And so ongoing training is essential. And the thing is that TLPI provides numerous free trainings, NADCP provides numerous free trainings, and so this is not something that A, is going to cost you money, and B, is not something where you always have to travel to. There's webinars, there's oftentimes TLPI and NADCP will come to your location and train you or do technical assistance. That's what we're here for. That's what we live to do. And so there's no reason why that ongoing interdisciplinary training can't happen. And also the cross training and making sure that you understand each other's roles and what's going to happen with those roles and how they work. And that's what makes a truly strong multidisciplinary team, is when you have that cross training and that ongoing connection. Next, please.
Hi, Mark. This is Marlon from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. We have a question from your last slide regarding evaluation. And that question is, what are your recommendations on how to include qualitative evaluations, especially in Native communities?
Okay, so this is what I would suggest. And I know that for some Native communities, this can be touchy. If you don't have an evaluator in your community, okay, you can reach out to colleges. And I know that there's some controversy about that from one of those studies that happened many, many years ago with the blood quantum, and I understand that. But most college universities are hungry to do studies. And the thing is if we don't start doing studies with some very clear guidelines, then there's never going to be studies in Indian country. And that's one of the big problems right now is when we look at, when we talk about programs or, treatment programs, the one of the biggest questions that keeps coming up is, well, there's no treatment program that's ever been designed with just the Native American population. There's been with Latino, there's been one with African American, but there isn't one with Native American. And that's because we have to get universities to start doing that. And so my recommendation would be, if you don't have somebody that's an evaluator, then reach out to your local college and your community college and ask them if they would want to do some evaluation and start looking at some of the progress you're doing with your treatment court team. That would be my best recommendation for finding an evaluator, especially in rural communities. I know that I live way up north, and the tribe that I work with, the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, that's what they finally did, is they opened up a small doorway to Michigan Tech with very clear guidelines that says, listen, this is what we're going to allow you to study, and this is what we want you to evaluate. And they formed a really good partnership. And so that would be my recommendation on how to do that. Or you can try to seek out and hire a private evaluator and see if there's one in your area that would do some evaluation and some number crunching. Does that answer the question good for you?
There are two follow-up points, keeping with the theme of evaluation. The question came up when looking at the meaning of qualitative. Could you also speak about perhaps incorporating other tools and mechanisms like talking circles, ceremonies, etc., that are not quantifiable? Perhaps things that also include storytelling.
Okay, but those can be quantifiable. And that's one of the things is if you work with your local university or your evaluator, if you don't want to go with the university, you can make some of that qualitative, meaning that you can do control groups where you have a talking circle. And absolutely, especially in Indian country, if you don't incorporate some of those cultural aspects into your program, and that goes back to that case management, then you're actually doing yourself a huge disservice, because that's one of those things that they found makes a connection. And so absolutely, you can include that, and you can include you can use white bison. There's all sorts of stuff you can do that still include that stuff and can still be part of that study. And that's truthfully what's lacking right now, is that we need to start showing that these things do work and how they work in Indian country.
And there is a follow-up recommendation that folks could look at, the Northwest Indian College as a potential resource.
That would be an awesome resource too.
No more follow-up questions here.
No more. Okay, I wish we had more follow-up questions. I like answering the questions better, guys. So the last key component we're going to talk about is forging partnerships. And this is kind of what I was just talking about, like working with a North American Indian College or other universities. A big part of this, and when we come and do trainings, we talk about this, is that you have to map your community. You have to map your community and look for all the resources that are in that community. Your Healing to Wellness Court team cannot do everything. You are not experts in housing. You're not experts in everything. And so if you don't do some type of community mapping and partnerships, forging partnerships with different agencies, then you're really doing a disservice to your participants, And so forging, when we talk about forging partnerships too, they don't have to just be in your local area. They can be forging partnerships with TLPI or TLPI and NADCP. That's a partnership. That's one of the things that we push heavily, is that once you start working with NADCP, you're part of that membership, you're part of us, you're part of something that you're always going to have. And so when we look at this, we really look at trying to create partnerships within your community. Partnerships that help you with fundraising so you can help fund some of your stuff, partnerships with services, partnerships so that you can fill those gaps that your participants have, and also fill the gaps that your program might have. You might need to reach out for an evaluator. And this is how we do this, is by forging partnerships that help with your multidisciplinary team. Now, does that mean they're part of the team? No, it means that they're helping you, that they're an advisory that can come on and help. That doesn't mean they're necessarily part of the team, but that's how we start doing that, is by forging partnerships and examining your community and seeing what's available in your community so that you can continue to help them. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about forging partnerships and trying to bring things together in a way that you can keep working together and have that ongoing overall institution, not experimentation. Next. Instead of throwing me in prison, Veterans Treatment Court offered me a chance of a lifetime. This is what we're shooting for, okay? When we talk about recovery, all right, recovery from mental health, recovery from substance use disorder, recovery in general, this is what we're talking about. And so oftentimes people associate lack of use of substance as part of recovery, when in reality, that's more of an abstinence, okay? Recovery means dealing with the whole problem, dealing with the whole family, the whole community, everything we're looking at. So the example I use, and I'm gonna use Marlon to be my teammate with this. So you don't have to say anything, Marlon, but you're part of this now. So me and Marlon decide that we're gonna go on a diet, all right? And we decide we're gonna go on a diet together. And this diet is a cabbage diet, all right? It means that's all we can eat for the next year is cabbage. And the one rule is we can't weigh ourselves for this year. We're not allowed to weigh ourselves for a year. So me and Marlon started eating our cabbage. We have fried cabbage and boiled cabbage and steamed cabbage, and we're really good. We do exactly what we're supposed to do, and we eat cabbage for a year. And we both jump on the scale, and we haven't lost a pound. I can promise you that Marlon and I are not gonna have cabbage for our next meal. When I talk about abstinence and recovery, abstinence is dieting and never losing weight. Recovery is a total lifestyle change. If all you shoot for is abstinence, then you're doing a disservice, because guess what? If me and Marlon have to keep eating cabbage because we're doing abstinence, I guarantee you we're not going to be very pleasant people to be around. I guarantee you we're not going to be happy people, and I guarantee you that every day when we see our friends eating pizza or having a life, we're going to be jealous, resentful, and it's going to be a struggle. Whereas recovery is when we change a lifestyle. We change everything around it, and then the substance use or the mental health gets better and improves, and eventually we get into those things of healthy living. But you can't have that if the only thing you're shooting for is recovery. With a tribal veterans treatment court, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at recovery. We're looking at helping to treat the enablement of the family. We're looking at educating them about the disease process. We're looking at finding housing, finding employment, finding ways to learn new coping skills to deal with the trauma that they went through, and also dealing with the trauma. And that's what our ultimate goal is for recovery. And that's what Veterans Treatment Court is about. Next. All right, we have a strategic planning notebook that we use when we do our trainings. One of the things they talk about is the 4 different dynamics of recovery, which is health, home, purpose, and community. These are all things we're talking about when we're talking about recovery. We're talking about improving their health, giving them a stable living environment, helping them find purpose, and helping them define a new community and a new peer group and a new way to live their life. And that's, again, kind of the end all be all of what Veterans Treatment Court's about. And I hope that this was useful. I hope that you guys got stuff, and I'm open for any questions you guys have.
Thank you, Mark. Just monitoring the question and the chat box, and there currently are no questions submitted at this time.
Okay, well, I hope it's because I was so informative.
And just for folks who are tuning in today, just as a friendly reminder, this is day 5 of a week-long series focusing on veteran treatment courts. You can find additional information on our website, wellnesscourts.org. In addition to the recordings and today's handouts reference, we also have all 4 days posted on the website. We also have the publications that are related to the Tribal Healing to Wellness Courts in our publication series. That is also located on wellnesscourts.org and also at our home website, which is home.tlpi.org. On behalf of the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, we want to thank Mr. Mark Panasiewicz for today's presentation, and also would like to thank the many people who decided to tune in today. And please feel free to email us. And as a reminder, you'll be receiving a follow-up email with today's recording and also an evaluation. Thank you so much, and everyone have a great day.